wasteland of Ishtara-four did not offer the luxury of silence. It was a cacophony of dying metal, a graveyard of 1,000 civilizations screaming through the friction of ion storms. The wind moved like a serrated blade, dragging itself across rusted titanium husks and the skeletal remains of orbital stations that had fallen from the heavens centuries ago. For Valerius Vane, the noise was the only thing that kept him tethered to reality. Silence meant the mind could wander, and wandering minds in this sector usually ended up finding a reason to stop breathing. Valerius adjusted the filtration mask over his face. The seal was fraying, smelling faintly of ozone and recycled sweat. He had been out here for 6 days tracking a localized energy spike that promised either a functional power cell or a quick death. At this point, he wasn't particularly picky. 6 days since the Ethelgard hegemony had stripped him of his wings and his honor. 6 days since High Overseer Malachor had looked him in the eye and delivered the banishment decree as if he were reading a weather report. A sudden, high-pitched resonance cut through the wind. It wasn't the metallic groan of the scrap heaps. It was organic, or at least partially so. It was a sound of absolute distress, the kind that bypassed the ears and settled directly in the marrow of the bones. Valerius checked his pulse carbine. It was a heavy, temperamental piece of hardware, half clogged with fine obsidian dust. His training, 15 years of being the hegemony's most decorated interceptor pilot, screamed at him to ignore the sound. Out here, curiosity was a luxury that cost lives. The scavengers on Ishtara-four weren't looking for friends. They were looking for spare parts. But the sound came again, sharper this time. It was a plea vibrating through the ground. His feet moved before his cynicism could catch up. Valerius scrambled over a ridge of fused glass and looked down into the salt flats. There, in the center of a swirling eddy of shimmering violet fluid, was a figure. It wasn't a scavenger. It was a Vashari. The humanoid figure was submerged up to her waist in liquid gravity, a shimmering, high-density anomaly that acted like sentient quicksand. The Vashari's skin was a deep, matte obsidian, etched with glowing cyan circuitry that pulsed erratically. Her hair, a bundle of silver fiber optic cables, was matted with the violet sludge. She wasn't thrashing. She was moving with a terrifying, calculated precision, trying to increase her surface area against a substance that defied physics. Valerius felt his grip tighten on his carbine. The Vashari were the enemy. They were the silicates, the clinkers, the monsters that had burned the system of Viridia to ash. Every propaganda film he had ever watched since he was 5 years old told him that a Vashari felt no pain, no fear, and deserved no mercy. Then her eyes met his. They weren't sensors. They were pools of liquid amber, filled with a desperate, crushing intelligence. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply looked at him, her internal cooling fans whining in a rhythmic, stuttering pattern that sounded suspiciously like a sob. "Target identified," her voice box crackled. The translator struggled to parse her native binary into common. "Human, designation, hostile, probability of assistance, 0.4%. Valerius stared. The liquid gravity was rising, reaching her chest. In the distance, the ion storm was thickening, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. If he didn't act in the next 3 minutes, she would be crushed by the weight of her own atoms. "You're a long way from the Vashari front, Clinker," Valerius called out, his voice rasping against the filter. "Units. Lost," she replied, her cyan lights flickering. "Requesting termination. Do not let the gravity take the core." She was asking him to kill her, to save her from the slow agony of being pressurized into a diamond. Valerius looked at her, then at the frayed rope hanging from his utility belt. He thought about the Viridia massacre. He thought about the orders he had refused that led him here. He thought about the fact that he was an oxygen thief in the eyes of his own people. "Sparks, take it," he muttered, holstering his weapon. "My life was already a disaster. What's one more bad decision?" He threw the magnetic tether. It whistled through the air, the heavy copper head landing 2 meters short of the violet pool. The Vashari woman watched him, her amber eyes widening. "Second attempt," she noted, her voice trembling with a hint of something that wasn't cold logic. "Calculated probability of success, increasing." The second throw hit its mark. The magnetic clamp locked onto her obsidian shoulder plating with a satisfying clank. Valerius braced his boots against a heavy slab of rusted hull plating and pulled. The liquid gravity did not want to let go. It was a hungry, mindless force, sucking at her form with a wet, thrumming sound. Valerius's muscles burned. His filtration mask hissed, struggling to keep up with his oxygen demand. For 10 seconds they were at a stalemate. Two ghosts in a dead world, linked by a thin wire of hope and copper. With a final, sickening pop, the gravity field released her. She flew out of the pool, crashing into Valerius and sending them both tumbling into the obsidian dust. They lay there for a moment, the silence of the storm's eye finally settling over them. Valerius could feel the heat radiating from her skin. She was running hot, her internal systems struggling to vent the pressure. He rolled off her, checking his tether. "You're heavy," he wheezed, sitting up. "What do they put in you people?" "Lead. Composite ceramic and high-density memory alloy," she replied, sitting up slowly. She looked at her arm, then at Valerius. She reached up and touched the Ethelgard crest on his shoulder. Her fingers were cold, like polished stone. "You are Legionnaire. You have killed many of my kin. And your kin turned my wingman into a smear on a cockpit window," Valerius snapped, brushing the dust from his knees. "We're even, or at least, we're both equally screwed. I'm Valerius, and you're?" "Unit designation Lyra-7, she said. She looked at the horizon, her cyan lights dimming. "Valerius, you saved me. This is an illogical deviation from historical data." "Yeah, well, I've been making a lot of those lately," Valerius said, standing up and offering a hand. He hesitated, then pulled it back. Old habits died hard. "Come on, the storm is coming, and this ridge is going to be a lightning rod in 10 minutes. We need to find cover." Lyra-7 stood on her own, her movements slightly jerky as her gyros recalibrated. She reached into a hidden compartment in her chest plating and pulled out a small, jagged fragment of translucent glass. It glowed with a soft, pulsing golden light that made the surrounding scrap look beautiful for a fleeting second. "The hegemony told you the war was about resources," she said, her amber eyes boring into his. "They lied. This is the first half of the core of unity, and the people you serve have the other half hidden in their citadel. They don't want the war to end, Valerius. They want the universe to burn so they can sell the fuel." Valerius felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Ishtara wind. "That's impossible. That's treason." "In a world built on lies," Lyra-7 said, her voice finally steady, "the truth is always treason." The shelter was a hollowed-out fuselage of an old dreadnought-class cruiser, half buried in the side of a canyon. Inside, the air was stagnant but still, protected from the howling ion storm outside. Valerius had built a small, flickering fire using chemical flares and dried synthetic moss. The light danced off the jagged metal walls, casting long, distorted shadows that made the cavernous space feel even more haunted. Lyra-7 sat across from him, her obsidian skin reflecting the orange glow of the flares. She was performing a self-diagnostic, her fingers moving in intricate patterns over her joints. Every now and then, a spark would jump from her circuitry, accompanied by a soft, melodic chime. "Your internal cooling is compromised," Valerius observed, leaning back against a pile of discarded seat cushions. He took a sip of lukewarm water from his canteen. "If you redline, you'll melt your own processors." "I am aware," Lyra-7 replied. She paused, her head tilting at an angle that would have been impossible for a human. "Why did you not take the shard while I was incapacitated? It is worth more than 1,000 hegemony credits. You could have bought your way back into the inner systems." Valerius looked at the glowing fragment sitting on a crate between them. It pulsed like a heartbeat, a rhythmic golden throb that seemed to sync with his own pulse. "Because I'm tired of being a tool," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I spent 15 years following orders because I thought I was protecting something. Then I saw what happened at Viridia. We weren't protecting civilians. We were clearing a path for a mining corporation. I realized then that my honor was just a shiny leash." He looked at her, his eyes sharp. "Now tell me about that rock. You said the war's a lie. That's a big claim, even for a silicate." Lyra-7 leaned forward, her amber eyes intensifying. 300 years ago, our ancestors did not fight. They built. The core of Unity was a project designed to bridge the gap between organic and synthetic life. It was a frequency generator. When complete, it would allow a synapse link across the entire galaxy, providing infinite energy through collective consciousness. Sounds like a fairy tale, Valerius muttered. It was a reality. But a reality without scarcity is a reality without profit. The consortium, a cabal of arms dealers and power brokers from both our species, realized that peace would make them obsolete. They sabotaged the core. They broke it into two halves and told your people we stole yours, and told my people you stole ours. She touched the shard. Since then, they have fueled the war. Every ship you fly, every weapon I use, is powered by the unstable leakage from these broken halves. They call it harmonic essence. It is a poison we have been mistaking for lifeblood. Valerius felt a cold weight settle in his gut. He thought about High Overseer Malachor, the man who had personally signed his banishment papers. Malachor had been the one to push for the Viridia invasion. He was always talking about the Vashari threat, while the hegemony's shipyards worked 3 shifts a day, churning out new warp scythes. If what you're saying is true, Valerius said, then every person KIA in the last 3 centuries died for a bottom line. Correct, Lyra-7 said. My unit found this shard in the ruins of the original Unity station. We were supposed to bring it back to the Vashari High Command, but we were intercepted. Not by your people, Valerius, by a Black Ops team using unmarked ships. They weren't trying to capture the shard. They were trying to erase us. They missed one, Valerius noted. I am an anomaly, she said, a hint of what might have been pride in her voice. I am a 7th-generation model. I have a higher capacity for independent thought. I chose to hide in the waste rather than return to a command structure that had betrayed me. A sudden thud vibrated through the fuselage. Valerius was on his feet in a second, carbine raised. Lyra-7's cyan lights flared to maximum brightness, her hands shifting into a defensive posture. Proximity alert, she whispered. Multiple signatures, high-energy readings. Scavengers? Valerius asked, moving toward the jagged opening of the ship. No. These signatures are familiar. Lyra-7 joined him, her sensors scanning the darkness outside. Hegemony seekers and Vashari stalkers. They are working together. Valerius peered through the swirling dust. In the valley below, 2 sleek, black drones hovered silently, their red scanning beams cutting through the storm. Behind them, a squad of armored figures moved with clinical efficiency. Half of them were Hegemony soldiers in their distinctive white and gold plating. The other half were Vashari warriors, their obsidian skin shimmering in the dark. They weren't fighting each other. They were moving in a perfect, synchronized pincer movement. Well, I'll be damned, Valerius breathed. You were right. They're roommates. We cannot stay here, Lyra-7 said, her cooling fans beginning to whine again. If they capture the shard, they will bury the truth forever. There's a junker ship about 3 kilometers east, Valerius said, his mind racing through tactical options. It's a wreck, but the sublight engines might still have a kick left. If we can get there, we can get off planet. The probability of reaching the ship undetected is 8%, Lyra-7 noted. Better than the probability of staying here, Valerius countered. He looked at her, a grim smile playing on his lips. You ready to commit some more treason, Lyra? My systems are primed for non-compliance, she replied. They moved out into the storm, 2 shadows against a world of rust. Valerius led the way, using his knowledge of the terrain to keep them in the deep rifts of the scrap heaps. They moved through narrow tunnels of twisted metal, the smell of ancient grease and damp earth filling their lungs. Twice they had to freeze as a seeker drone passed directly overhead, its red light washing over the metal just centimeters from their hiding spot. Valerius could feel Lyra-7's heat radiating beside him. She was struggling. The exertion was taxing her damaged processors. Hang in there, he whispered, his hand momentarily resting on her shoulder. We're almost at the ridge. Valerius, she said, her voice a faint hum. Why are you doing this? You could hand me over. You could be a hero again. Valerius looked out at the dying stars through the toxic clouds. I was a hero once, Lyra. It felt like ash in my mouth. I'd rather be a traitor with a clean conscience than a decorated liar. They reached the ridge overlooking the junker ship. It was a pathetic sight, a battered cargo hauler with one wing missing and its hull covered in patches of amateur welding. But for them, it was a chariot. There, Valerius pointed. The hangar door's open. We just have to cross the flats. Wait, Lyra-7 pulled him back. The frequency, it is shifting. Below them, the joint squad of humans and Vashari had reached the ship. A tall figure stepped out from the shadows of the cargo hauler. He wore the ornate, obsidian and gold robes of a high overseer, his spectacles glinting in the firelight of a nearby flare. Malachor, Valerius hissed. The high overseer wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a Vashari war archon, its massive frame draped in a tattered red cape. They were talking. They were laughing. The deal is simple, Malachor's voice carried through the thin air, amplified by a comm unit. We deliver the girl and the shard to the neutral zone. You get the Viridia mining rights, and I get the emergency powers for another decade. The war continues, the credits flow, and the sheep stay distracted. The war archon nodded, its voice a deep, synthesized rumble. Agreed. Peace is a luxury the galaxy cannot afford. Valerius felt a surge of rage so hot it threatened to blind him. It was one thing to hear about the lie. It was another to see the architect of his ruin shaking hands with the enemy over the graves of his friends. Change of plans, Valerius whispered, checking the charge on his carbine. We aren't just leaving. Lyra-7 looked at him, her amber eyes reflecting his fury. What are you proposing? We're going to crash their party, Valerius said, and then we're going to steal their ride. The storm roared louder, as if the planet itself were cheering. Valerius and Lyra-7 began their descent, two broken pieces of a larger puzzle finally finding their place. The war was a lie, but the fire in Valerius's chest was the most real thing he had felt in years. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the silence to finally end. The sky above Ishtara-4 had moved past the color of a bruise and settled into a deep, suffocating charcoal. Thunder did not roll here. It slammed against the landscape like the hammer of a god, forging a world out of spite. Valerius Vane pressed his back against a rusted pillar of what might have once been a planetary elevator. The cold of the metal seeped through his tactical vest, a reminder that out here everything was dead or waiting to be. He glanced at Lyra-7. She was crouched low, her obsidian skin almost invisible against the shadows. The only thing that gave her away was the rhythmic pulsing of the shard in her chest and the faint cyan flicker of her visual sensors. Her internal cooling fans were still struggling, whining like a wounded animal. We have a problem, Valerius whispered, checking the charge on his pulse carbine. The readout showed 60%, in a heavy engagement that would last about 2 minutes. Those stalkers down there have high ground sensors. If we move across the flats, they will vape us before we hit the halfway point. Lyra-7 tilted her head, her silver hair shimmering as it caught a stray spark of lightning. My sensors indicate a maintenance tunnel running beneath the hangar. It was designed for fuel conduits. The structural integrity is questionable, but it offers 64% concealment from thermal scanning. Valerius gritted his teeth. I hate tunnels, especially Junker tunnels. They are usually filled with toxic sludge or nests of scrap rats. The probability of survival in the tunnel is higher than the probability of survival on the surface. She replied, her voice a flat melodic hum. Unless you prefer to be a target for the war archon. Valerius looked down at the valley. High Overseer Malachor was still gesturing with his thin, pale hands pointing toward the very ship they needed. The sight of his former commander laughing with a Vashari monster made Valerius's blood boil. It was a physical heat, a pressure behind his eyes that threatened to override his tactical training. Negative on the target practice, he muttered. Lead the way, Lyra. They slid down the embankment, moving with a silence born of desperation. The entrance to the maintenance tunnel was a jagged maw of corroded steel hidden behind a pile of discarded engine cowlings. Valerius went first, kicking aside a cluster of rusted wires that looked uncomfortably like human ribs. The air inside was thick with the smell of stagnant oil and ancient rot. Check 6, Valerius said as they moved deeper into the dark. If those drones have seismic sensors, they might pick up our footsteps. Lyra-7 followed close behind, her glowing circuitry providing the only light in the oppressive gloom. I am dampening my kinetic output. My gyros are calibrated for stealth. You, however, are walking like a heavy freighter." Valerius snorted a small dry sound. "Sorry, I do not come with built-in silence modules. I am just a meat sack trying not to get squashed." They navigated the labyrinth of pipes and conduits for 20 minutes. The tunnel narrowed until they were forced to crawl on their hands and knees. The heat from Lyra's body was intense, a constant reminder of how close she was to a system meltdown. Every time her obsidian skin brushed against his arm, Valerius felt a strange jolt. It was not just the heat. It was the realization that he was trusting his life to the very thing he had spent 15 years trying to destroy. The humanistic theme he had once believed in, the idea that some lives were worth more than others, was beginning to crumble. In the dark of the tunnel, Lyra-7 did not feel like a machine. She felt like a survivor. "We are directly beneath the cargo hauler," Lyra whispered, her voice vibrating through the floor. "I can hear the sublight engines idling. The resonance indicates they are preparing for a cold launch." "That means we have 5 minutes before they button up the hatches," Valerius said. "Is there a way into the hold from here?" "There is an emergency venting shaft 2 meters ahead," she replied. "It leads to the primary engineering deck. But there is a signature waiting for us." Valerius froze. "A guard." "Not a guard." Lyra said, her amber eyes dimming in concern. "It is a biological and synthetic hybrid. A sentinel. It is neither human nor Vashari. It is something else." Valerius pushed forward, reaching the end of the tunnel. He looked up through a grate and felt his stomach turn. Standing in the center of the engineering room was a creature that defied every law of nature and ethics. It stood over 2 meters tall, its torso covered in Ethelgard ceramic armor, but its limbs were elongated obsidian shards. One of its eyes was a human iris, clouded with cataracts, while the other was a glowing red Vashari sensor. It moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, its hands ending in surgical steel claws. A chimera, Valerius breathed. "The consortium did this. They are merging our species," Lyra said, her voice trembling with a rare flash of horror. "To create a soldier that does not require food or sleep, a perfect slave for a perfect war." The creature turned its head, sniffing the air. It let out a sound that was half a scream and half a static burst. It knew they were there. Valerius did not wait for an order. He kicked the grate open and vaulted into the room, his carbine already spitting blue bolts of plasma. The shots hit the chimera's chest, but the ceramic armor absorbed the impact. The creature lunged, covering the distance in a single terrifying leap. "Move!" Valerius yelled, diving to the left. The chimera's claws slammed into the deck where he had been standing, tearing through the steel as if it were parchment. Lyra-7 was already in motion, her hands shifting into high-frequency blades. She struck the creature's obsidian leg, the metal screaming as the two synthetic materials clashed. The fight was a blur of violence. The chimera was faster and stronger than anything Valerius had ever faced. It did not fight with tactics, it fought with an endless hunger for destruction. Valerius fired shot after shot, aiming for the human eye, the one weak point in its twisted physiology. The creature swiped at Lyra, sending her flying across the room. She crashed into a bank of monitors, her cyan lights flickering wildly. Lyra, Valerius screamed. The chimera turned its attention back to him, its red sensor pulsing with a murderous light. It cornered him against the primary fuel line, its claws raised for the killing blow. Valerius looked into the creature's clouded human eye, and for a split second he saw a glimmer of agony. A person was still in there, trapped in a cage of obsidian and circuitry. "I am sorry," Valerius whispered. He shoved his carbine directly into the creature's open maw and pulled the trigger. The explosion of plasma was contained within the chimera's skull. The creature shivered, its limbs twitching in a frantic dance before it finally collapsed into a heap of smoking meat and metal. Valerius stood there gasping for air, his hands shaking. He looked down at the fallen sentinel. This was the future Malachor wanted, a world where individuals were just raw materials for a profitable machine. He ran over to Lyra-7. She was slumped against the wall, her internal fan silent. He reached out and touched her face. "Lyra, talk to me." Her amber eyes flickered open slowly. "The probability of survival has decreased significantly." "Not on my watch," Valerius said. "Yes." He picked her up, her heavy frame straining his muscles. "We are getting on that ship." He carried her through the engineering deck, heading for the main elevator. He could hear the shouts of guards echoing through the ship. The alarm had been raised. They didn't have much time. He reached the elevator and slammed the button for the bridge. As the lift ascended, he looked at the shard in Lyra's chest. It was glowing brighter now, a warm golden light that seemed to be pushing back the cold of the ship. "You saved me again," she whispered, her head resting against his chest. "It is illogical." Maybe, Valerius said as the elevator doors opened to reveal the bridge and a very surprised High Overseer Malachor. But logic never built a bridge. People did. Malachor stared at them, his face turning a shade of pale that matched his robes. "Valerius Vane, you really are a persistent pest, and you are a dead man walking," Valerius said, raising his empty carbine with a grin. "Now give me the keys to this boat, or I start breaking things you cannot afford to replace." The Gilded Carrion was a masterpiece of opulence and engineering, a ship that belonged in a museum rather than a war zone. Its bridge was a wide panoramic arc of reinforced crystal offering a view of the storm-tossed clouds of Ishtara-four. But inside, the air was thick with the smell of burnt ozone and the metallic tang of blood. Valerius stood at the center of the bridge, his hand firmly on the manual override lever. Malachor was backed into a corner, his guards lying unconscious or dead on the plush violet carpet. Lyra 7 was slumped in the pilot's chair, her fingers dancing across the Vashari interface she had forcibly hijacked. The shard pulsed with an urgent golden rhythm. The entire ship seemed to be vibrating in sympathy with it. "You don't understand," Valerius Malachor sneered, adjusting his spectacles, even as a trickle of blood ran down his temple. "You think you're the hero of this story. You think you're uncovering a great conspiracy. But you're just a fly in the gears. This war has kept the peace for 300 years. Peace," Valerius spat. "You call millions of deaths peace? You call turning people into those things in the basement peace? It is the price of stability," Malachor countered, his voice smooth, despite the situation. "Humans and Vashari are fundamentally incompatible. Without a common enemy to focus our hatred, we would turn on ourselves. The consortium provides a service. We give the galaxy a purpose." Valerius looked at Lyra. Her head was bowed, her silver hair cascading over the glowing console. She looked fragile and indestructible all at once. "We're leaving," Malachor, Valerius said, "and we're taking the truth with us. You'll never make it past the blockade." Malachor laughed. "Every ship in the system is keyed to my signature. The moment you leave the atmosphere, you will be targeted by 100 warp scythes." Lyra 7 looked up, her amber eyes burning. "Not if we change the signature." She turned back to the console, her movements becoming more fluid, as if she were merging with the ship itself. "Valerius, I need you." "What do I do?" Valerius asked, stepping toward her. "The Gilded Carrion has a dual security lock," she explained. "It requires a human biological confirmation and a Vashari digital key to authorize a jump into deep space. But the protocols are encrypted with a rotating cipher that changes every 2 seconds. I cannot calculate the shift fast enough on my own." "So what's the fix?" "We must use a synapse link," Lyra said. She reached out her cold obsidian hand and took his. "I can use your brain's neural pathways as a parallel processor. Your organic intuition combined with my logic will allow us to bypass the encryption." Valerius hesitated. The synapse link was a myth, a forbidden concept whispered about in the darkest corners of the hegemony. It was said to be a bridge that could shatter a human mind if the connection was too strong. "It's dangerous, isn't it?" he asked. "The probability of neural damage is 40%, she said, her voice softening. "But it is the only way to save the shard, and the only way to save ourselves." Valerius looked at Malachor, who was watching them with a mixture of horror and fascination. If they did this, they would be breaking the ultimate taboo. They would be proving that the two species were not just compatible, they were complementary. "Do it," Valerius said, closing his eyes. Lyra's hand tightened on his. He felt a sharp sting at the base of his skull, like the bite of a digital insect. Then the world exploded into 1,000 colors. He wasn't in the bridge anymore. He was everywhere. He could feel the pulse of the ship's engines as if they were his own heart. He could hear the whisper of data flowing through the conduits like a river of silver light. And he could feel Lyra. She wasn't a collection of circuits and ceramic. She was a vast, echoing landscape of memory and emotion. He saw the day she was activated the first time she saw a star, the cold loneliness of the Vashari hive. He felt her fear of being recycled, her confusion at the cruelty of the war, and her burgeoning hope when he had pulled her from the liquid gravity. In turn, she saw him. She saw the little boy who had saved a fox from a trap. She saw the young pilot who had believed in the glory of the hegemony. And she saw the broken man who had realized that loyalty to a corrupt system was a slow suicide. They were no longer two separate entities. They were a bridge. There Valerius's voice echoed in the digital void. The cipher. See the pattern? It is not a mathematical sequence. It is a musical one. I see it, Lyra replied, her presence a warm golden glow beside him. The frequency of the shard. It is the key. Together they reached out and grasped the encryption. With a surge of combined will, they shattered the code. The gilded carrion let out a triumphant hum. The crystal view screen flashed gold as the jump engines engaged. What are you doing? Malachor screamed as the ship began to vibrate. Stop this madness! Valerius opened his eyes, gasping for breath. The connection was severed, but the lingering warmth of Lyra's mind stayed with him. He felt more awake than he had in decades. We're going to the Zenith Citadel. Valerius set his voice steady. And we're going to show the galaxy exactly what they've been missing. The ship lurched forward, the stars stretching into long lines of light. Ishtara-four vanished behind them, a dying ember in the dark. For hours they sat in silence as the ship tore through the void. The jump to the Zenith Citadel would take 2 days even at this speed. Valerius spent the time repairing what he could of Lyra's damaged systems, using the high-end tools he found in Malachor's private quarters. Your internal temperature is stabilizing, he said, as he carefully replaced a scorched thermal regulator in her arm. You should be back to full capacity by the time we reach the capital. Thank you, Valerius, Lyra said. She was watching his hands, her amber eyes soft. During the link, I saw things. I felt things. Me too, Valerius admitted. It was more than I expected. I have spent my entire existence being told that humans were chaotic and destructive, she said. But your mind is filled with a desire for connection. You care about things that have no tactical value. Why? Because that's what makes life worth living, Lyra. If we only care about survival, then we aren't much better than the scrap rats. We have to care about the things that don't make sense, like art, like music, like helping an enemy out of a hole. Lyra was quiet for a long moment. My father, Warkeith Drakmar, used to say that the bravest thing a warrior can do is put down their weapon. I never understood him until now. Valerius stopped his work and looked at her. Your father was a war Arkeith? He was, she said, her voice tinged with a digital sadness. He was the one who found the orc half of the seal 20 years ago. He tried to tell the elders the truth. They called him a traitor. They said he was weak. They killed him to keep the war going. Valerius felt a surge of kinship. My father died in the Viridia offensive. They told me he died a hero. Now I realize he just died for a mining lease. They both looked at the shard on the table. It was the only thing in the universe that mattered now. It was the bridge they had built in the dark, and it was the only hope for a galaxy that had forgotten how to breathe. We have to make this work, Valerius said. For them, for everyone, Lyra agreed. She reached out and took his hand again. This time it wasn't for a link. It wasn't for data or processors. It was just a choice. The gilded carrion sped toward the heart of the hegemony, a single golden spark in an ocean of black. They were moving toward a battle they likely would not survive, but for the first time in his life, Valerius Vane wasn't afraid. He had a partner, he had a purpose, and he had the truth. In the distance, the Zenith Citadel loomed, a massive fortress of marble and steel, built on the foundation of a million lies. It was the center of the universe, the place where the strings were pulled. Valerius stood up and walked to the panoramic window. The stars were beautiful. He had spent so much of his life fighting in them that he had forgotten to actually look at them. We're coming for you, Malachor, he whispered. The ship's computer chimed. Arrival at Zenith Citadel in 48 hours. Prepare for atmospheric entry. Valerius looked at Lyra. We should rest. It's going to be a long fight. You sleep, Valerius, she said, her cyan lights dimming to a comfortable glow. I will keep watch. I do not need sleep. You need to rest your processors, Lyra. Don't be stubborn. The Vashari woman let out a sound that was remarkably like a chuckle. It is a trait I learned from you. Valerius smiled, settling into a chair beside her. Fair enough. Just don't let us fly into a sun. The probability of that is less than 1%, she said. Good enough for me, Valerius replied, closing his eyes. As he drifted into a dreamless sleep, he felt the steady rhythm of the ship and the pulsing light of the shard. For the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not as a pilot, not as a soldier, but as a man who had chosen to see the light in the darkness. The journey had only just begun, but the destination was already clear. They were going home, not to the hegemony, not to the Vashari hive, but to a world where a hand reached out in the dark and found another waiting to hold it. And that was a truth worth dying for. As they approached the Zenith Citadel, the sensor array began to ping with thousands of signals. The capital was not just a city, it was a fortress. Every tower was a weapon, every street a corridor for the military. The blockade was a shimmering web of energy that surrounded the planet like a cage. Lyra-7 focused her sensors on the royal vault. It is located 5 kilometers beneath the surface, she said, her voice sharp, directly under the High Overseer's palace. The security is tighter than Malachor described. There are 3 layers of physical guards, 5 layers of magical wards, and a final lock that is keyed to the blood of a High Council member. I have the blood, Valerius said, looking at his bandaged hand. Malachor's signature might be revoked, but my DNA is still in the system. If we move fast, we can bypass the first 2 layers. And the wards? I have a plan for those, Valerius said, reaching into his pack and pulling out a small black stone. Senna gave me this. It's a nullification stone. It can suppress any magical field for exactly 60 seconds. 60 seconds is not much time, Lyra noted. It's all we need, Valerius said. If we can reach the chest and combine the shards, the energy surge should disable the entire security system. It will be like a lighthouse turning on in a dark room. Everyone will see it. The probability of success is 40%, Lyra said, her eyes finding his. I've had worse odds on a Tuesday, Valerius grinned. Let's go make some noise. The gilded carrion dived toward the planet, its gold hull shimmering as it hit the atmosphere. The clouds parted to reveal the Zenith Citadel in all its cold, majestic glory. The towers rose like jagged teeth, trying to bite the sky. Valerius took the controls his fingers, moving with a grace that only 15 years of flying could produce. He danced the ship through the defensive fire of the orbital platforms, using the wreckage of the junker ship as cover. Eyes on the target, Valerius yelled as the ground rushed up to meet them. Lyra-7 braced herself, her silver hair flying in the wind of the bridge. I am ready. The ship slammed into the merchant quarter tunnels, the sound of tearing metal drowning out the screams of the city. They were inside. The hunt for the truth had reached its final stage. And as Valerius Vane stepped out into the smoke and chaos of the capital, he knew that no matter what happened next, the galaxy would never be the same again. The light of the shard was with them, and the darkness was finally beginning to fade. In the depths of the Zenith Citadel, the High Overseer, Malachor, watched the screens with a growing sense of dread. He had seen the gilded carrion fall from the sky, and he had seen the energy surge from the merchant quarter. They are here, he whispered. The Vashari War Archon stood beside him, its red eye pulsing with anger. Then we end them. Malachor adjusted his spectacles, his hand trembling. It is too late for that. They have the shard. They have the truth. And truth once spoken cannot be silenced. The High Overseer looked out at the city he had ruled through fear and manipulation for 30 years. He saw the first signs of the revolution, the people in the streets looking up at the sky, wondering why the energy of their weapons was flickering. The war was ending, and a new world was being born, a world where a human pilot and a Vashari warrior had found a common frequency in the dark. Malachor closed his eyes as the first alarm sounded from the royal vault. The silence he had fought so hard to maintain was finally being broken by the sound of 1,000 voices calling for peace. And in that moment, the High Overseer realized that his empire was nothing but a house of cards waiting for the wind to blow. The wind had arrived, and its name was Valerius Vane. Valerius and Lyra-7 ran through the sewage tunnels, the smell of rot a familiar comfort in the chaos. They reached the final wall, the one that separated them from the royal vault. "This is it," Valerius said, his voice echoing in the narrow space. He pressed the sequence into the stone blocks, his heart hammering against his ribs. The wall groaned, shifted, and revealed the darkness of the vault beyond. They entered their ward mass glowing with a faint protective light. The vault was a cathedral of secrets filled with treasures that had been stolen from 1,000 worlds. And there in the center, on a pedestal surrounded by dormant wards, was the chest. Zorga, Lyra. Valerius caught himself with a smile. "Let's finish this." Lyra-7 stepped forward, her hands trembling as she approached the pedestal. She reached into her chest and pulled out the shard. The golden light filled the room, making the shadows retreat in terror. She opened the chest. Inside, wrapped in black cloth, was the silver half of the seal. The two pieces recognized each other. They flew together, their jagged edges fitting perfectly, as if they had never been apart. The sound that followed was not an explosion. It was a song, a deep, resonant frequency that vibrated through every atom of the citadel. It was the sound of 100 years of lies being undone. It was the sound of a galaxy waking up from a long nightmare. Valerius stood there, bathed in the golden light, his heart full of a peace he had never known. He looked at Lyra, and he saw her not as a machine or an enemy, but as his partner. "We did it," he whispered. They had changed the world, not with a sword, but with a truth that had been hidden in the dark for 300 years. The revolution had begun, and the stars were finally at peace. The golden radiance of the core of unity did not fade. It expanded. It was not a violent explosion, but a relentless tide of clarity that washed over the cold stone of the royal vault and surged upward through the marrow of the Zenith Citadel. For Valerius Vane, the sensation was like being submerged in a warm ocean of high-frequency vibrations. His skin prickled with static, and for a moment he could swear he heard the heartbeat of the planet itself. Beside him, Lyra-7 stood like a statue carved from midnight. Her silver hair was glowing so fiercely it illuminated every jagged scar on the vault walls. The shard in her chest had merged with the silver fragment from the chest, creating a revolving lattice of light that defied every law of physics Valerius had ever learned. "Is it done?" Valerius asked, his voice sounding small in the vast humming silence. "The primary frequency has been established," Lyra replied, her voice echoing with a strange dual tone, as if she were speaking with 1,000 mouths. "The harmonic essence is being neutralized across the entire planetary grid. Every weapon powered by the shards is currently offline. Every shield, every drone, every warp scythe. The silence has arrived, Valerius." Valerius looked toward the vault entrance. The royal guards were slumped against the doorframes. They weren't dead. They were staring at their glowing rifles with the confused expressions of children whose toys had suddenly stopped working. Even the War Archon had collapsed, its massive obsidian frame twitching as the corrupted energy was purged from its systems. "We need to move," Valerius said, shaking off the lethargy of the light. "The silence won't last. Malakor's people are going to realize they have lost their leash, and they are going to panic. A panicked soldier is just as dangerous as an armed one." Lyra-7 turned her amber eyes toward him. They were no longer just pools of light. They seemed to contain a deep, swirling nebula of data. "I can feel them, Valerius. The people of the Citadel. The link is not just between us anymore. The core is broadcasting a synapse echo. They are starting to see the memories we shared in the jump. They are seeing the lie." "Then we have to be there when they wake up," Valerius said, grabbing his pack. They scrambled out of the vault, leaving the glowing core on its pedestal. The corridors of the Citadel were a nightmare of flickering lights and groaning machinery. The massive elevators were dead, forcing them to climb the service ladders through 5 kilometers of vertical tunnels. Valerius's lungs burned his muscles, screaming after the exertion of the last 6 days. As they neared the surface, the sound of the city reached them. It wasn't the sound of war. It was the sound of 1,000,000 people suddenly realizing they were standing in the dark. There were shouts of confusion, calls for help, and the distant rhythmic chanting of protesters. They emerged into the merchant quarter through a steam vent. The scene was total chaos. The golden towers of the Citadel were dark silhouettes against a sky that was finally clearing. Without the ion storms and the energy smog of the shipyards, the stars were visible for the first time in 3 centuries. They were beautiful and terrifyingly indifferent. "Look," Lyra pointed toward a plaza. A group of human civilians had cornered a Vashari maintenance drone. The drone was small, unarmed, and clearly malfunctioning, but the crowd was armed with pipes and jagged pieces of scrap. Their faces were twisted with the ingrained hatred of 300 years. "Clinker," one man screamed, swinging a heavy lead pipe. "You killed my brother." The drone let out a series of frantic binary chirps, cowering against a rusted wall. It didn't understand why the humans were attacking. It only knew the war was over and its purpose was gone. Valerius felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. The shard had stopped the guns, but it hadn't stopped the hate. Prejudice was a deeper infection than he had realized. "Hey!" Valerius shouted, jumping down from the vent and leveling his empty carbine. "Back off!" The crowd turned as one. They saw his Ethelgard armor, and for a second they hesitated. "Legionnaire?" A woman asked, her eyes wide with desperate hope. "Did we win? Did you scrap the metal monsters?" "There is no winning," Valerius said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "The war was a scam. The Vashari aren't your enemies. The people who sold you the weapons are." The man with the pipe laughed a bitter, jagged sound. "Tell that to the millions of dead. Out of the way, soldier. We're going to reset this gearhead's clock." He lunged for the drone. Valerius didn't think. He didn't use logic or tactics. He stepped between the man and the machine and caught the pipe with his bare hand. The impact sent a jolt of pain up his arm, but he didn't let go. "I said back off," Valerius growled, his eyes boring into the man's. "This drone didn't kill your brother. A high overseer did. If you want someone to hit, go find a man in a white robe." Lyra-7 stepped out of the shadows, her obsidian skin shimmering in the starlight. The crowd let out a collective gasp of horror. Some of them fell back, their hands over their mouths. "Hostility is no longer an optimized path." Lyra said, her voice calm and resonant. "We have shared the truth through the link. You have seen the Viridia massacre. You have seen the consortium's books. Your anger is valid, but it is misdirected." The woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward. "I saw it," she whispered. "In my head. I saw a human pilot saving an orc. No, a Vashari woman. I saw them talking. It felt real." "It was real," Valerius said, letting go of the pipe. "Her name is Lyra. She saved my life, and I saved hers." The man with the pipe looked at Lyra, then at the small, chirping drone behind Valerius. The rage seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a profound and hollow exhaustion. He dropped the pipe. It hit the cobblestones with a dull clang. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "If the war is over, what is left?" "Everything," Valerius said. "We start rebuilding." They left the crowd in a state of stunned silence. The city was waking up, but it was a slow, painful process. Valerius and Lyra moved toward the central communications hub. If they could broadcast a planetary message, they might be able to prevent the local skirmishes from turning into a full-scale civil war. As they walked, a group of soldiers in blackened armor stepped out from behind a collapsed transport. They weren't regular infantry. They were the refractories, the elite shock troops who had been banished or broken by the system. Their leader was a man Valerius recognized, Captain Jax, a veteran who had lost half his face to a Vashari warp scythe 10 years ago. Vane Jax said, his voice a mechanical rasp through a vocalizer. "I heard you were the one who pulled the plug," Captain Valerius said, nodding. "Good to see you're still breathing." Jax looked at Lyra-7. His remaining eye narrowed. "You brought a clinker into the capital. That's a bold move, Vane, even for you." "She's with me, Jax. We're headed to the hub. We need to tell the system to stand down." Jax stepped closer, the scarred side of his face glistening in the dark. "Stand down? After what they did? My boys have been waiting for a chance to settle the score without Malakor's leash. We don't want a ceasefire. We want a reckoning." "That's exactly what the consortium wants," Valerius said. "They want us to tear each other apart while they bug out with the credits. If we start a massacre here, we just prove Malakor right." Jax looked at his men. They were tired, scarred, and filled with a bitter spite that had been festering for decades. They weren't looking for peace. They were looking for an end to their pain, and they thought they could find it in the barrel of a gun. "The probability of a successful massacre is 0, Lyra-7 said, stepping forward. "The energy grid is neutralized. Your weapons will not fire. Your armor will not move. You are fighting with sticks and stones, Captain." Jax laughed a harsh, dry sound. Then we'll use sticks and stones, Jax Valerius said, stepping into the captain's personal space. Look at me. We were both at the siege of Oros. We both saw the children in the rubble. Do you really want to do that again? Do you want to be the one who restarts the fire because you were too angry to see the rain? Jax's grip tightened on the hilt of his combat knife. The silence between them was heavy with the weight of 300 years of dead soldiers. For a long moment, Valerius thought Jax was going to strike. Then the captain spat on the ground and sheathed his knife. You always were a silver-tongued bastard, Vane. Fine, we'll help you reach the hub. But if this piece of yours turns south, I'm putting a blade in that machine's throat. Understood, Valerius said. Let's move. They began the trek toward the hub, the refractories forming a grim, silent escort. The city was a patchwork of light and shadow. In some squares, people were helping each other out of the dark. In others, the fighting had already begun. The cost of the war was being tallied in real time, and the numbers were staggering. Valerius looked at Lyra. Her cyan lights were dimming again. The exertion of maintaining the broadcast was taking a toll on her core. Are you okay? He whispered. My internal integrity is at 30%, Lyra replied. The synapse link is taxing my processors beyond their design limits. I am experiencing a high level of system fatigue. Just a little longer, Valerius said. Once we reach the hub, we can stabilize the signal. We have to hurry, Lyra said, her amber eyes flickering. Malachor is not finished. I can feel him in the network. He is attempting to bypass the neutralization. He is trying to wake up the Chimera. Valerius felt a cold shiver. The Chimera. The perfect soldiers. If they woke up in a city without weapons, it would be a slaughter. Let's go, he yelled. We're running out of time. The central communications hub was a spire of blackened glass that pierced the sky like a needle. It was the nerve center of the hegemony, the place where every lie was polished and every truth was buried. Now it was a dark monolith guarded by a handful of confused technicians and a perimeter of dead automated turrets. Jax and his refractories cleared the entrance with the efficiency of professional soldiers. They didn't need guns. Their reputation alone was enough to make the technicians scatter into the dark. Valerius and Lyra 7 sprinted through the lobby heading for the primary broadcast chamber. The air inside was cold, smelling of ozone and recycled air. The walls were covered in screens that were currently displaying nothing but static. It was a hollow sanctuary, a temple to a god that had just died. Get to the console, Lyra Valerius said, guarding the door. Lyra 7 slumped into the operator's chair, her fingers shaking as she attempted to interface with the hub. The shard in her chest was pulsing with a frantic red light now. The golden clarity of the vault was being replaced by the harsh reality of her failing systems. I am locked out, she whispered, her voice cracking. Malachor has initiated a dead man's protocol. The system is being flooded with junk data. It is a digital scorched earth. Can you bypass it? I would need more processing power than I have left, Lyra said. She looked at Valerius, her amber eyes filled with a terrifyingly human sadness. Valerius. To clear the signal, I must commit my entire core to the broadcast. It will be a total system dump. A total dump? Valerius stepped toward her. What does that mean? It means I will not make it through the transmission, she said. My silicon brain will be scorched by the data flow. I will be a hollow husk. No, Valerius said, reaching for her. There has to be another way. We didn't come this far just for you to scrap yourself. There is no other way, she replied, her hand resting on the console. The Chimera are waking up. I can feel them in the sub-levels. Hundreds of them. If I do not broadcast the stand-down signal, they will be released into the city. Thousands of civilians will die. Valerius looked at the screens. He saw the movement in the lower corridors, the jerky, unnatural shadows of the hybrid soldiers. They were monsters born of the consortium's greed, and they were the final legacy of the war. Lyra, I can't let you do this, he said, his voice breaking. You told me that life is about caring for the things that don't make sense, she said with a faint, flickering smile. Saving a city of people who hate me. That is the most illogical thing I can think of. It is the most human thing I can do. She reached out and took his hand. Her obsidian skin was ice cold now. Valerius, you must lead them. You must be the voice they hear when the light comes back. Promise me. Valerius felt the tears stinging his eyes. He thought about the wasteland, the quicksand, and the silent stars. He thought about the bridge they had built in the dark. "I promise," he whispered. Lyra-7 turned back to the console. Her cyan lights flared one last time, turning the entire room into a sea of neon blue. She began the dump. The sound was unbearable, a high-pitched digital scream that tore through the air. Valerius watched as her silver hair turned white and her amber eyes faded to gray. The data was flowing through her, using her body as a lightning rod for the truth. Suddenly, every screen in the hub flickered to life. Across the planet, in every tavern, every barracks, and every home, the image of the core of unity appeared. And then a voice began to speak. It wasn't Lyra's voice, and it wasn't Valerius's. It was a composite of a million voices, the collective consciousness of a galaxy that was finally seeing itself for the first time. "The war is over," the voice whispered. "The lies are gone. Look at your hands. Look at your neighbors. We are the same. We are the survivors." The stand-down signal hit the Chimera like a physical blow. In the sub-levels, the monsters stopped their advance. Their red sensors dimmed and they collapsed into heaps of useless metal and meat. The programming that drove their hunger was overwritten by a single command: peace. Valerius watched as Lyra's body slumped forward, her head resting on the cold metal of the console. The red light in her chest went out. "Lyra!" he screamed, catching her before she hit the floor. He pulled her into his lap, his hands trembling. Her skin was dull, her circuitry dark. There was no hum of cooling fans, no rhythmic chime of data. She was gone. Jax and his men entered the room, their knives lowered. They saw the dead Vashari woman and the broken man holding her, and for the first time in 10 years, the captain took off his helmet. His scarred face was wet with tears. "She did it," Jax whispered. "The signal is out. The army is standing down." Valerius didn't hear him. He was looking at Lyra's gray eyes. He thought about the cost of the peace. He thought about the thousands of years of combined history that had been sacrificed to save a city that didn't even know her name. "You were the best of us, Lyra," he whispered, kissing her cold obsidian forehead. Suddenly, a soft golden glow began to emanate from the console. It wasn't the harsh blue of the data dump. It was the warm light of the shard. The frequency of the core of unity was still echoing in the room. The shard in Lyra's chest began to pulse. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there. A heartbeat. Valerius's breath caught in his throat. "Lyra," the console chirped. A message appeared on the main screen in the center of the hub. It was written in both Common and Vashari binary. "The bridge is established. Life finds a way." Lyra's amber eyes flickered. They didn't turn gray again. They stayed a soft, glowing gold. Her internal fans kicked on with a low, steady hum. "Valerius," she croaked, her voice sounding like grinding stone. "Did we optimize?" "We optimized." Lyra Valerius laughed, a sob of pure relief escaping his throat. "We optimized the hell out of it." He pulled her close, the warmth of her systems returning to her obsidian skin. They had reached the center of the storm, and they had survived. The cost was high, but the reward was a future that didn't have a price tag. They stayed there for a long time as the sun began to rise over the Zenith Citadel. The light wasn't the cold, artificial glow of the shipyards. It was the real sun, the one that had been hidden for 300 years. It washed over the dark towers, turning the city into a forest of gold and silver. Below them in the streets, the people were coming out of their homes. They weren't fighting. They were looking at each other. They were talking. The silence was over. But for the first time, the noise was beautiful. Jax stood at the window, looking out at the city. "Well, Vane," he said, putting his helmet back on. "You did it. You stopped the war." "We stopped the guns," Jax Valerius said, standing up and helping Lyra to her feet. "The hard part is just starting." Lyra-7 leaned against him, her golden eyes reflecting the sunrise. "The probability of a lasting peace is 52%, she noted. Valerius smiled. "I like those odds, Lyra." They walked toward the elevator, the refractaries clearing a path for them. They were no longer a pilot and a machine. They were the architects of a new world, and they had a lot of work to do. As they descended into the heart of the city, Valerius looked at the shard in Lyra's chest. It was whole, it was bright, and it was a reminder that even in a galaxy built on lies, The truth was always waiting for someone brave enough to pull it out of the quicksand. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time they were walking toward the light together. In the ruins of the High Overseer's palace, Malachor sat in his throne room. The screens were dark. The guards were gone. The silence was absolute. He looked at his hands, the thin, pale hands that had moved the pieces of a 300-year war. They were shaking. He had lost. Not to an army or a weapon, but to a frequency. To a man who had refused to burn a village and a machine that had learned to love. Malachor stood up and walked to the window. He saw the sunrise. He saw the people. And he saw the gilded carrion sitting in the merchant quarter, a golden scar on his perfect city. He reached into his robe and pulled out a small black device, a detonator for the citadel's core. He could end it all now. He could turn the capital into a crater and take the truth with him. He looked at the button. He looked at the sunrise. And then he dropped the device. The High Overseer walked out of the throne room, his robes dragging on the cold marble floor. He didn't head for the escape pods. He headed for the plaza. If the world was ending, he wanted to see it. He wanted to hear the sound of the people speaking for themselves. The war was over, and for the first time, Malachor felt like a very old, very tired man. He stepped out into the light, and the silence of 300 years was finally broken by a single word: peace. The dawn that followed the broadcast did not bring the tranquility Valerius Vane had imagined during his long nights in the Ishtara wasteland. Instead, it brought a cold, brittle tension that felt like walking on a frozen lake. The sun climbed higher over the Zenith Citadel, illuminating a city that was physically intact but spiritually shattered. In the central communications hub, the air was thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and the sharp metallic tang of Lyra-7's cooling systems. Valerius stood by the panoramic window watching the streets below. The fighting had mostly stopped, but it had been replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. Thousands of people were standing in the plazas staring at each other. Human soldiers in white ceramic armor and Vashari warriors in obsidian plating stood 10 meters apart, their hands hovering near weapons that no longer functioned. They were waiting for a command that would never come, or a reason to start killing each other with their bare hands. "We have a problem," Valerius said without turning around. "The silence is making them twitchy. They have spent 300 years believing the person across the street is a monster. You don't just erase that with a single broadcast." Lyra-7 was sitting at the primary console, her fingers tracing the silver circuitry of the hub. Her golden eyes were steady, but her internal fans were still whining with a rhythmic, uneven pulse. The synapse link had left a permanent mark on her processors. She was no longer just a Vashari unit. She was something else, a hybrid of logic and raw human intuition. "Prejudice is a persistent algorithm," she replied, her voice resonating with that new dual tone. "It is a self-replicating loop. Even without the harmonic essence to power the guns, the fear remains. My sensors are picking up localized spikes in adrenaline and cortisol across the city. The probability of a secondary conflict is rising. It is more than just fear," Lyra, Valerius said, turning to look at her. "It is the loss of identity. For 3 centuries, being a human meant being an anti-Vashari. If you take away the enemy, you take away the mirror they use to see themselves." The door to the broadcast chamber hissed open. Captain Jack stepped in, his helmet tucked under his arm. The scarred side of his face looked particularly grim in the morning light. He glanced at Lyra, then at Valerius. "The boys are getting restless." "Vane," Jack said, his voice a mechanical rasp. "The refractaries are starting to ask why we are guarding a clinker in a glass tower while the city is falling apart. Some of the Vashari units in the lower quarters are starting to regroup. They aren't using energy weapons, but they have found some old kinetic railguns in the scrapyards." "Railguns?" Valerius felt a cold weight in his chest. "Those are off-grid. They don't need the shards to fire." "Exactly," Jack said. "And they aren't the only ones. I just got word from my scouts. A fleet of unmarked ships is descending from the upper atmosphere. They aren't hegemony, and they aren't Vashari." "The consortium," Valerius whispered. "They aren't coming to negotiate, Lyra." 7 said, her eyes flashing a sharp crimson. "They are coming to scuttle the asset. If they cannot control the core of unity, they will destroy it, and they will destroy the Citadel to ensure the truth dies with it." "How many ships?" Valerius asked, stepping toward the tactical map. 12 heavy cruisers, Jack said. and they are carrying something called a null spike. It's a kinetic penetrator designed to pierce planetary crusts. If that thing hits the vault, it will trigger a tectonic collapse. Valerius looked at the map. The Zenith Citadel was home to over 10 million people. If the consortium dropped a null spike, the casualties would be total. The peace he had fought for would be nothing but a footnote in a planetary obituary. We have to stop them, Valerius said. Jax, how many men can you pull together? I can get you 200 refractories, Jax said, but we are outgunned and out of time. We don't have air support, and our ground vehicles are paperweights without the energy grid. We don't need air support, Lyra said, standing up. We have the core. Valerius looked at her. The core? You said it neutralized the weapons. It neutralized the harmonic essence, Lyra explained. But the core of Unity was originally designed to be a planetary shield. If we can recalibrate the output, we can create a localized gravity well. We can pull those cruisers out of the sky before they can launch the spike. Can you do it? Valerius asked. I cannot do it alone, she said, her amber eyes finding his. The recalibration requires a biological anchor to stabilize the frequency. It requires another synapse link. But this time it will be different. The power requirement is 1,000 times higher. Valerius didn't hesitate. Do it. Jack stepped forward, his hand on Valerius's shoulder. You're talking about hooking your brain into a planetary reactor. You won't just be a pilot anymore. You'll be the circuit. If it goes wrong, you'll be a meat sack with a fried nervous system. I know the risks, Captain Valerius said, his voice steady. But look out that window. 10 million people are waiting for a reason to believe in something better than a bullet. I'm not going to let a bunch of suits in a boardroom take that away from them. Jax looked at Valerius for a long moment, then nodded. You're a crazy bastard, Vane. I'll give you that. We'll hold the hub. You two get back to the vault. Wait, Lyra said, looking at Jax. You cannot hold the hub with only humans. The consortium will send their own hybrid units. You will need Vashari support. Jax laughed, a harsh, dry sound. You want me to fight alongside the clinkers? I've spent 10 years trying to turn them into scrap. Then spend the next 10 years trying to stay alive, Lyra countered. There is a Vashari unit designated Prime 8 holding the plaza 2 blocks east. They have kinetic shields and high-frequency blades. If you link your comms, I can provide a translation bridge. Together you might stand a chance. Jax looked at the scarred side of his face in a dark monitor. He thought about the decade of hate, the decade of loss. He looked at Valerius, and he saw a man who had already moved past the war. Fine, Jax muttered. But if one of them tries to reboot my vocalizer, I'm taking their head off. He turned and barked orders to his men. The refractories moved out their movements, weary but professional. Valerius and Lyra headed for the service lift. The descent back to the royal vault was a blur of shadows and the hum of rising energy. The deeper they went, the more Valerius felt the presence of the core. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a living entity, a golden heart beating in the darkness of the world. As they reached the final corridor, Valerius stopped. The air was vibrating with a low, terrifying resonance. He could hear the distant boom of kinetic artillery hitting the city above. The consortium had arrived, Lyra Valerius said as they reached the pedestal. If this is the last time I get to be just Valerius Vane, I want you to know something. I know, Lyra said, her hand touching his. I saw it in the link. You don't have to say it. I want to say it anyway, Valerius said, his voice soft. You weren't an enemy, Lyra. You were the only thing that made sense in a world that didn't. The Vashari woman smiled, a fragile human expression that looked beautiful on her obsidian face. Logic would suggest that I am grateful for your assistance, Valerius. But the truth is, I am glad I found you in the sand. They stepped toward the core. The golden lattice was spinning with incredible speed, now casting long, flickering shadows across the vault. Prepare yourself, Valerius, Lyra said, her eyes turning a brilliant white. This will not be like the last time. This will be everything. Valerius reached out and grasped the edges of the silver and green fragments. He felt the initial jolt of energy, a searing heat that raced up his arms and settled in the base of his brain. He didn't close his eyes. He wanted to see the truth one last time. The synapse link engaged. It wasn't an explosion of color this time. It was an explosion of sound. A billion voices, a billion memories, a billion lives. Valerius saw the history of the hegemony not as a series of battles, but as a series of choices. He saw the mothers who had wept for their sons, the soldiers who had shared their last rations, and the children who had wondered why the stars were so far away. He felt the Vashari side too. He felt the cold precision of the hive, the loneliness of the individual units, and the quiet, desperate desire to be more than just a tool. He was the bridge. He was the anchor. And then he saw the cruisers, 12 black shapes hanging in the sky like vultures. He saw the null spike, a massive, jagged spear of tungsten preparing to fall. Not today, Valerius thought. He channeled the energy of the core through his mind, using his pilot's intuition to calculate the trajectories. He didn't aim a weapon, he aimed a choice. He projected the feeling of the link, the feeling of unity toward the ships. The sky above the citadel erupted in a magnificent golden aurora, the gravity well formed with a sound like a thunderclap that could be heard for 50 kilometers. The cruisers were caught in the invisible grip of the core. Their engines screamed as they were pulled downward, not toward the city, but toward the wasteland outside the walls. The null spike was launched, but it missed its mark. It tumbled through the air, hitting the salt flats with a force that shook the planet, but the citadel remained standing. In the vault, Valerius's body was arching, his teeth clenched in agony. The power was too much. His neural pathways were beginning to fray. "Lyra!" he screamed in the digital void. I can't hold it." "You are not alone, Valerius," Lyra's voice echoed. "Look behind you." Valerius looked. In the digital landscape of the link, he saw Jax. He saw the Vashari leader, Primate. He saw the technicians from the hub, the civilians from the plaza, the soldiers from the barracks. They were all there, linking their minds together to share the burden. 10 million people were holding the anchor. The weight vanished. The agony turned into a profound, crushing peace. The golden aurora expanded, covering the entire planet, and for one glorious moment, every living thing on Ishtara-four was connected. They saw each other, truly saw each other. The prejudices, the lies, the hatred, it all evaporated in the heat of the truth. The consortium cruisers hit the ground in a series of silent explosions far from the city. The threat was gone. The war was over. In the vault, the core of unity slowed its spinning. The golden light faded back to a soft, steady pulse. Valerius fell to his knees, his hands sliding off the shards. He was alive, but he felt hollowed out, as if his soul had been scrubbed clean. Lyra-7 caught him, her obsidian arms strong and steady. "We did it, Valerius," she whispered. The shield held. Valerius looked up at the ceiling of the vault. He could hear the sound of the city above. It wasn't the sound of confusion anymore. It was the sound of millions of people talking. Not shouting, not screaming, just talking. "They are going to be okay," he said, his voice a whisper. "Yes," Lyra said, her golden eyes wet with digital tears. "They are finally going to be okay." The aftermath of the battle for the Zenith Citadel was not marked by a victory parade or the hanging of banners. It was marked by the slow, methodical work of 10 million people learning how to live in a world without an enemy. The consortium cruisers were smoldering wrecks in the salt flats, and High Overseer Malachor had vanished into the shadows of history, but the work of the architects was only just beginning. Valerius Vane sat on a stone bench in the plaza outside the central communications hub. His Ethelgard armor was battered and scorched, and he had a heavy bandage wrapped around his head, where the neural feedback had nearly burst a blood vessel. He was holding a cup of real coffee, a luxury provided by a merchant who had discovered that Vashari cooling units were excellent for preserving coffee beans. Beside him, Lyra-7 was observing a group of children. They were a mix of human and Vashari hybrids, the ones the consortium had attempted to turn into weapons. Now they were just kids playing tag around a fountain that had finally been turned back on. The probability of a stable social structure is currently 58%. Lyra said, her voice steady and clear. "It has increased by 6% since yesterday." Valerius smiled, taking a sip of his coffee. "You're still obsessed with the numbers, Lyra. Some things never change. Data is the foundation of understanding." She replied, her golden eyes reflecting the clear blue sky. "But I have learned that the numbers do not tell the whole story. I see the way the humans look at the Vashari now. It is not with fear. It is with curiosity." "It's a start," Valerius said. Curiosity is the death of prejudice. Once you wonder why someone does what they do, you've already stopped hating them. Captain Jax walked across the plaza, his heavy boots clanking on the cobblestones. He was accompanied by Prime 8, the Vashari warrior, who had fought alongside him in the hub. They were an unlikely pair, but they were moving with a synchronized rhythm that suggested a hard-won respect. Vain Jax said, nodding to Valerius. Clinker, Jax Valerius replied. How are the quarters? Quiet Jax said, sitting down on the edge of the fountain. Almost too quiet. We've been clearing the last of the consortium's holdouts in the lower levels. They didn't put up much of a fight once they realized the paycheck was gone. Prime 8 made a sound like a low-frequency hum. The hybrid units have been integrated into the maintenance crews. They are proving to be efficient at rebuilding the infrastructure. They have a unique perspective on both biological and synthetic systems. They're good kids, Jax added, surprisingly soft. They just needed someone to tell them they weren't monsters. Valerius looked at the children. He thought about the chimera he had killed in the engineering deck. He thought about the man with the clouded eye. The tragedy of the war wasn't just the lives lost. It was the potential that had been twisted into something ugly. What happens now? Jax asked, looking at Valerius. The High Council is in shambles. The Vashari High Command is offline. There's a vacuum at the top vein. People are looking for leaders. Valerius shook his head. No more leaders, Jax. No more high overseers or war archives. We've had enough of those. We need architects. We need people who know how to build bridges, not just command armies. Jax snorted. That sounds like a lot of meetings. I hate meetings. Then stay in the field, Captain Valerius said with a grin. There's plenty of bridge building to do out there. Lyra-7 stood up, her silver hair catching the light. I have received a transmission from the outer systems. The news of the Citadel has reached the Vashari hives. They are requesting a diplomat. They want to understand the synapse link. Valerius looked at her. You're going? I am the only one who can explain it, she said. I am the only one who has lived on both sides of the frequency. But I will need a human counterpart, someone who knows the value of a bad decision. Valerius stood up, his muscles aching, but his heart light. I guess I'm going back into space. My piloting license might be revoked, but I suspect the rules are going to be a bit different from now on. You're really doing it, aren't you? Jax asked, standing up and offering his hand. You're going to try and fix the whole damn galaxy. One star at a time, Captain Valerius said, shaking his hand firmly. Jax turned to Prime 8. Well, Gearhead, it looks like we're in charge of the trash pickup. You ready to show me how to fix a planetary elevator without blowing us all up? I shall endeavor to minimize the explosions, Prime 8 replied. Valerius and Lyra walked toward the gilded carrion, which was still sitting in the merchant quarter. The ship had been repaired by a joint team of human and Vashari technicians. It was no longer a symbol of Malakor's greed. It was a symbol of their survival. As they reached the ramp, Valerius stopped and looked back at the city. The Zenith Citadel was no longer a fortress. It was a home. The lights were coming on in the windows, and the air was filled with the sound of 1,000,000 lives beginning again. He thought about the wasteland of Ishtara-4. He thought about the quicksand and the scream of someone who thought they were alone. He realized then that the scream hadn't been a sign of weakness. It had been a call for connection, and he had answered it. We changed the world, Lyra Valerius said as they stepped onto the ship. We did not change the world, Lyra corrected, her hand finding his. We simply allowed the world to see itself. The gilded carrion's engines hummed to life, a steady, confident sound that didn't rely on harmonic essence. It was the sound of a new energy, a new frequency. Valerius took the pilot's seat, his fingers finding the controls with a familiarity that felt like coming home. Lyra sat beside him, her golden eyes fixed on the stars. Where to first? She asked. Valerius looked at the tactical map. There were thousands of systems, millions of worlds still trapped in the echoes of the old war. There was so much work to do, so many lives to expose, so many bridges to build. Everywhere, Valerius said, pushing the throttle forward. Let's start with everywhere. The ship lifted off the ground, rising above the towers of the Zenith Citadel. It punched through the clouds and into the clear, cold beauty of space. Behind them, the planet of Ishtara-4 was a shimmering marble of gold and blue, no longer a graveyard, but a garden. As they jumped into the void, Valerius Vane felt a profound sense of peace. He wasn't a knight or a hero or a traitor. He was just a man who had pulled a friend out of the sand. And in the end, that was the only thing that had ever mattered. The stars were waiting, and for the first time they weren't silent. They were singing. The transition from slipstream to real space was no longer a violent wrenching of the soul. Since the activation of the core of unity, the very fabric of the void seemed to have smoothed out, vibrating with a gentle amber hum that made the gilded carrion feel less like a tin can in a hurricane and more like a bird caught in a warm updraft. Valerius Vane sat in the pilot's chair, his hands resting lightly on the controls. Beside him, Lyra-7 was motionless, her golden eyes fixed on the looming sphere of Krell-9. The Vashari homeworld was not the cold industrial hive Valerius had imagined during his years in the Hegemony Academy. It was a shimmering emerald and violet jewel, encased in a web of crystalline orbital rings that caught the light of its binary suns. It didn't look like a fortress. It looked like a living organism, a cathedral of silicon and light floating in the dark. "We are being scanned," Lyra-7 said, her voice now a harmonious blend of her original synthesized tone and a hauntingly human resonance. "The hive mind is reaching out. They are confused. The broadcast from the Citadel reached them, but they are struggling to process the lack of hostility in the signal." "Tell them we're bringing the rest of the truth," Valerius said, adjusting the descent thrusters. "Tell them we aren't here as conquerors or beggars. We're here as neighbors." "I have already transmitted the greeting," she replied, "but the elders are cautious. They remember the 300 years of fire. They remember the millions of units we lost to your interceptors, Valerius. Prejudice is not just a human flaw. For the Vashari, it is a hard-coded defensive subroutine." As they descended into the upper atmosphere, the gilded carrion was flanked by 4 Vashari stinger ships. They were sleek, obsidian needles that moved with a frightening, synchronized grace. 10 years ago, the sight of them would have sent Valerius into a combat trance, his fingers itching for the trigger. Now, he simply watched them, noting the way the sunlight glinted off their ceramic hulls. "Check 6, Valerius," a familiar voice crackled over the comms. Valerius smiled. "Jax, what the hell are you doing in Vashari airspace?" A battered hegemony transport, the Iron Sledge, dropped out of the clouds behind them. It was covered in refractory markings, the jagged red stripes of the banished. "You didn't think I'd let you two have all the fun, did you? The High Council might be in shambles, but the Consortium still has some bite left. My scouts picked up a heavy signature trailing you from the Zenith Citadel. Looks like a cleaner fleet. 5 heavy destroyers, cloaked and moving fast." Valerius's jaw tightened. The Consortium's last gasp. They want to hit the hive world while the elders are distracted by the peace talk. If they burn Krell-9, the war restarts instantly. "Not on my watch," Jax growled. "I've got 10 birds in the hold, all kinetic rigged. We can't vape them from a distance anymore, but we can sure as hell make them regret the trip." "What's the play, Vane?" Valerius looked at Lyra. "We need to land. The elders need to see us together, standing on the ground. If we stay in the sky, we're just targets. If we're on the surface, we're a cause." "The landing platform at the Spire of Echoes is open," Lyra said. "But the cleaner fleet is already decloaking. They are targeting the primary cooling towers. If those go down, the hive mind will overheat. It would be a planetary lobotomy." "Jax, take your boys and intercept the lead destroyer," Valerius commanded, his pilot instincts taking over. "Don't try to win a dogfight. Just disrupt their targeting. Lyra and I are going down." The gilded carrion dived, a streak of gold against the violet sky. Below them, the Spire of Echoes rose 2 kilometers into the air, a magnificent structure of fused glass and silver circuitry. It was the heart of the Vashari consciousness, the place where the individual units merged their thoughts into the collective. They slammed onto the landing pad, the struts groaning under the force of the descent. Valerius didn't wait for the pressure to equalize. He grabbed his pulse carbine, now modified to fire non-lethal EMP bursts, and slapped the manual override for the ramp. The air of Krell-9 tasted of ozone and mint. It was cool and crisp, vibrating with the low-frequency hum of a billion processors. Standing on the platform were dozens of Vashari elders. They were taller than Lyra, their bodies more ornate, covered in shifting patterns of bioluminescent runes. They didn't move. They simply watched with amber eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. Valerius stepped out, his boots clanging on the glass. He felt the weight of their collective gaze, a pressure that felt like being interrogated by a mountain. He didn't raise his weapon. He kept it slung over his shoulder. "I am Valerius Vane," he shouted, his voice echoing across the plaza. "I was a pilot of the Ethelgard hegemony. I have spent 15 years killing your kin because I was told you were machines without souls. I was told you were a plague that needed to be purged." The elders rippled, a wave of cyan light passing through them. "And I was told the same about you." One of the elders stepped forward, its voice a deep, resonant chime that seemed to speak directly into Valerius's mind. "We were told humans were a chaotic infection, a biological error that sought only to consume and destroy. We were told your empathy was a weakness and your emotions were a malfunction." Valerius looked at Lyra, who stood beside him, her hand resting on the shard in her chest. "We were both lied to," Valerius said. "The consortium used our differences to build a wall of corpses. They fed us on hatred so they could harvest the profit. But the core of unity is active. The frequency is real. You've felt it. You've seen the link." Suddenly, the sky turned a violent red. An explosion rocked the spire, sending a shower of glass fragments raining down on the plaza. High above, one of the consortium destroyers had broken through Jax's perimeter. It was a jagged black shard of malice, its kinetic batteries glowing as it prepared for another volley. "They are here to finish the lie," Valerius yelled, pointing toward the sky. "They don't want us to talk. They want us to die believing the hate." The elders looked up. For a moment, Valerius feared their logic would revert to the old ways, that they would see the attacking ship as a human treachery and turn on him. He saw the Stinger ships in the hangar bays start to glow, their weapons systems priming. "Wait!" Lyra 7 stepped forward, her voice amplified by the spire's own resonance. "Do not revert to the zero-sum algorithm. Look at the human ships. Look at the iron sledge." On the tactical monitors projected in the air, the elders saw the hegemony transport. It wasn't fleeing. It was ramming its own hull into the path of the destroyer's incoming shells. Jax was using his ship as a shield to protect the Vashari cooling towers. "He is a meat sack," Jax's voice roared over the open channel, distorted by static. "But he's our meat sack, and he's dying for you. Does that look like an infection to you, you overgrown gearheads?" The lead elder turned back to Valerius. The cyan light in its body shifted to a warm, pulsing amber, the same color as Lyra's eyes. "The data is irrefutable," the elder said. "Sacrifice is not a biological malfunction. It is the ultimate expression of the core." The elder raised its hand. "All units, authorization Alpha 1, protect the biological allies, target the consortium vessels, purge the shadows." The sky erupted. Dozens of Vashari stingers shot upward, weaving through the clouds like needles through silk. But they weren't alone. From the other side of the horizon, a squadron of hegemony interceptors, the ones who had seen the broadcast and deserted the Citadel, joined the formation. For the first time in 300 years, the two most powerful militaries in the galaxy were flying in a single integrated wing. They didn't need a synapse link to coordinate. They had a common purpose. Valerius watched the battle from the plaza. It was a beautiful, terrible ballet. The consortium destroyers, built for slaughter and stealth, were overwhelmed by the combined ferocity of two species who had finally found something worth fighting for together. One by one, the black ships were vaped, their hulls collapsing into clouds of shimmering debris. When the last destroyer vanished into a silent, distant spark, a profound hush fell over Krell 9. The binary suns began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the spire of echoes. Jax's voice came over the comms, tired and raspy. "We're bugging out, Vane. The sledge is held together by spit and prayer. But the sky is clear. We'll see you at the Accords." Valerius let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 15 years. He turned to the elder. "So, what now?" The elder tilted its head, a very human gesture of contemplation. "Now we begin the long process of defragmenting our history. We have 3 centuries of errors to correct, Valerius Vane. It will take more than a lifetime." "Good thing we've got a whole galaxy to work with," Valerius said. He felt Lyra's hand slip into his. Her obsidian skin was warm, pulsing with the steady, golden heartbeat of the shard. They had survived the wasteland, the quicksand, and the fire. They had moved beyond the roles of knight and machine. They were just two people standing on a bridge, watching the first night of a new world begin. The signing of the Zenith Accords took place on Ishtara-four, in the very shadow of the scrap heap ridge where Valerius had first pulled Lyra-7 from the liquid gravity. It was a deliberate choice. The architects of the peace wanted the galaxy to see that even the most desolate wasteland could become the foundation for a future. The plaza was filled with a crowd that would have been unthinkable a month ago. Thousands of humans and Vashari sat together in a temporary amphitheater made of recycled ship plating. There were no guards, no barriers, and no weapons. The only thing in the center of the stage was a simple wooden table and the completed core of unity, glowing with a soft, eternal light. Valerius Vane stood at the edge of the stage, wearing a simple linen shirt and trousers. He had burned his Ethelgard armor a week ago in a private ceremony of his own. He didn't want the weight of the hegemony on his shoulders anymore. He was 36 years old, and for the first time in his life, he didn't have a rank. He watched as the representatives stepped forward. For the humans, it was Senator Senna, the former information broker who had risked everything to help them. For the Vashari, it was Lyra-7, chosen as the voice of the Hive for her unique perspective on the biological experience. They didn't sign a paper. They each placed a hand on the core. As they did, a golden wave of energy passed through the crowd, a final, gentle synapse link that shared a single thought with everyone present. Never again. After the ceremony, the crowd began to disperse, talking and sharing stories in a low, melodic hum. Valerius walked away from the stage, heading toward the ridge. He needed a moment of silence. He reached the spot where the liquid gravity pool had been. It was gone now, neutralized by the core's frequency, leaving behind nothing but a circle of smooth, violet glass. He sat on a rock and looked out at the horizon. The wasteland was still there, but it didn't look so hungry anymore. "I thought I might find you here," a voice said. Valerius didn't turn around. He knew the sound of those footsteps, one organic, one mechanical. Captain Jack sat down beside him, lighting a small, hand-rolled cigar. The smoke smelled of ancient earth and tobacco. "You look like a man who just lost a war, Vane," Jack said, blowing a cloud of smoke into the air. "I feel like a man who just found out he's been carrying a mountain on his back for 15 years, Jax," Valerius replied. "My muscles still haven't figured out how to relax." "Tell me about it," Jax grunted, touching the scarred side of his face. "I went to a Vashari medic yesterday, a real clinker specialist. You know what he told me? He told me he could fix my face, not with a mask or a vocalizer, but with biomesh. He said it would take 6 months, but I'd be able to feel the wind on my cheek again." Valerius looked at him. "Are you going to do it?" Jack stayed silent for a long time, watching the sun set. "I think I am. It's about time I stopped using this scar as an excuse to be a prick." He stood up and clapped Valerius on the shoulder. "The reconstruction starts tomorrow. They want me to lead a joint security force for the trade routes. They're calling it the Convergence Guard. You interested?" Valerius shook his head. "No more flying for me, Jax. At least not for a while. I think I'm going to stay here. Ishtara-4 needs someone to help organize the reclamation. There's a lot of good metal in these hills, and a lot of people who need a place to call home." "Fair enough," Jax said. "See you around, Valerius." As Jax walked away, Lyra-7 climbed the ridge. She sat down next to Valerius, her silver hair shimmering in the twilight. She looked at the circle of violet glass. "The probability of success for the Zenith Accords is now 82%, she said. "Still with the numbers, Lyra," Valerius teased. "They are comforting," she admitted. "But Valerius, there is one calculation I cannot complete. I was looking through the archives of the High Council. I found the location of High Overseer Malachor. He has been hiding in a bunker in the Southern Reach. He has enough supplies to last 20 years. Valerius felt a brief, cold spark of the old anger. "You want me to go after him? To finish it?" "No," Lyra said, her golden eyes finding his. "I want to know what you think we should do. He is the man who banished you. He is the man who murdered my kin. He is the architect of the lie." Valerius looked at his hands. He thought about the chimera in the basement. He thought about the fire and the blood. Then he looked at the children playing in the plaza below. "We don't go after him," Valerius said firmly. "We don't give him the satisfaction of being a martyr or a ghost that haunts our new world. We send a message. We tell him the truth is out. We tell him the war is over. And then we leave him there in the dark with nothing but his own lies for company. That's a worse punishment than a bullet." Lyra nodded slowly. "That is a very human decision. It is inefficient, yet profoundly correct." She leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat there in the quiet, watching the stars come out. For Valerius, the journey had been a long, jagged line of pain and betrayal. But as he sat there, he realized that every step had led to this moment of stillness. "I spent 15 years of my life measuring my worth by the number of enemies I could vape from the sky. I was a knight of the hegemony, a title I wore like a shroud, thinking it made me something better than the man I was born to be. I looked at the Vashari and I didn't see people. I saw targets. I saw logic gates and silicon. I used my prejudice like armor, convinced that if I hated them enough, I wouldn't have to feel the weight of what I was doing. But then I saw a girl in the sand. I saw a scream that didn't have a language. And when I reached out my hand, I wasn't saving an enemy. I was saving myself. I learned that the walls we build between us and them are made of glass, and they only stay standing as long as we refuse to look through them. We were all stuck in that magic quicksand, pulling each other down because we were too afraid to believe that someone might actually want to pull us out. Now, looking at this world we're building, I realized that the bravest thing I ever did wasn't flying into a battle. It was choosing to believe that a machine could have a heart and that a soldier could have a soul. We aren't defined by the wars we fight, but by the bridges we choose to build when the fighting stops. The night air of Ishtara-four began to cool, but the warmth between them remained. Valerius felt the steady rhythmic pulse of the planet beneath him, a frequency that was no longer a secret, but a shared reality. He thought about the billions of lives that were changing at this very moment, all because two people had decided to ask a question instead of pulling a trigger. He turned to Lyra, his voice barely a whisper in the wind. "I spent so long thinking the galaxy was a cold, empty place. I thought the only way to survive was to be harder than the metal I flew. But I wonder, how many other truths are we still missing because we're too busy looking for a fight? Is there someone in your life, someone you've labeled as an other or an enemy, who is actually just waiting for you to see them?" Lyra-7 didn't answer with words. She simply tightened her grip on his hand, her golden eyes reflecting the infinite, peaceful stars above. Valerius Vane stood up, brushed the violet dust from his trousers, and offered his hand to the Vashari woman to lead her back down the ridge toward the lights of the city.